and welcome to this webinar on the economy and living standards hosted by the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. I'm Adrian Pabst, NIESR's Deputy Director for Public Policy, and it's my great pleasure to chair today's events, the first in a series of events on the UK general election between now and polling day on the 4th of July. We're incredibly grateful to the Nuffield Foundation for supporting our work. And I'm joined today by three colleagues who will be talking us through some of the main economic issues that will be front and center of this election debate. We are joined by my colleague, Ben Caswell, who is senior economist in the macro team, Ed Conforth, who's economist in the macro team, and Anna Bajataji, who is research lead on household and regional modeling in the public policy team. Before giving them the floor, I'm going to make a few opening remarks. And I want to start with the point that, as everyone has seen, the economy really is going to be front and center of the election campaign. We've already heard a lot from the parties about their spending plans, their plans for taxation, prospects for growth, inflation, productivity, and living standards. NIESR, as the oldest independent economic and social research institute, is uniquely positioned to do two things in this election. One is to improve public understanding of economics, of what is actually happening in the economy and in society, and how we can best think about both problems, but also solutions. And secondly, to put forward policy ideas that have not necessarily been raised by the parties and that we think really should be debated as people make up their minds as to who should be the next government. I'm going to just talk us through some of those issues before handing the floor to Ben. So where are we in terms of the UK economy ahead of the general election on the 4th of July? Well, there's no doubt that the economy is in doldrums. Growth is low, productivity is flatlining, inflation is falling, but it's persistent in certain areas, especially service sectors. And as a result, interest rates are not coming down as fast as they might have done in previous times. And all of that, of course, is a brake on investment, which in turn doesn't help with growth, with productivity, and indeed with living standards. And we are seeing lower living standards now than at the time of the previous election. And in fact, quite deep falls in living standards once we take into account housing costs. And Arnab will explain that in a bit more detail shortly. We think, and we've been making this case consistently, that the only way to get Britain out of the doldrums is for higher public and business investment. And that in turn requires a new fiscal framework. And both Ben and Ed will be making that case in their presentations. Before handing them the floor, I just want to say that NIESR has been very consistent in making two arguments. One is that inflation is a matter for the Bank of England and for the Bank of England only, and that therefore we should not be assessing this or that party on whether inflation is coming down or not. It is simply not a matter for them. Of course, we've also been saying that the bank has got a very important job to do to communicate its thinking about the monetary policy path and to do a lot better in terms of forward guidance. And that is, we think, very, very key in terms of clarity. And linked to that, once monetary policy has a clearly defined path, fiscal policy needs to be much more about just meeting fiscal targets. These fiscal targets are essentially arbitrary. They are short-termist, and they do not really focus enough about the objectives. What are we trying to achieve? And if the objective is higher growth, higher productivity, and therefore higher living standards and greater well-being, then we need to be working backwards from those objectives to the best possible fiscal rules. If not, if we're just treating the rules as sacrosanct, it is the ultimate triumph of means over ends without actually meeting the needs of the country and the people. So these are really the two key messages we've been making, and it's now my great pleasure to give the floor to Ben Caswell to talk us through the macroeconomic context and some of the thinking around the new fiscal framework that we've been arguing for here at NIESR. Ben, thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Adrian. So turning to the macroeconomic context in which the UK economy finds itself, the UK economy has performed relatively poorly since the last election, and indeed prior to that. And if we just turn back to one slide so we can see the productivity figures and the GDP per head figures, we will see that on the left here, we have productivity as per OECD economies and also for the UK economy. Now, the UK economy is below average productivity growth relative to its OECD peers. Moreover, GDP per head is also lower to where it is now relative to its 2019 Q4 figure. So as we can see, that UK productivity is closely tracking OECD average until about 2008. And then after that, it tails off and it averages about just under 1% per year. And this falls in about the bottom 2/3 relative to comparable economies. Now, for GDP per head on the right, there's been no recovery in GDP per capita since the pandemic. In fact, GDP per head is slightly below its previous figure during the last election. It's about 1% lower than it was previously. In practice, this means for each person in the UK, they're about £380 worse off per year in real terms relative to where they were 5 years ago. So taking a look at the fiscal targets, what does this mean? Well, naturally, if there's poor productivity performance and poor GDP growth, this naturally has consequences for fiscal headroom and public finances. So if we take a look at these fiscal targets, we can see that according to our forecasts, that the government is not set to meet its fiscal mandate on either count. Now, specifically, as the current rules stand, GDP debt to GDP ratio must be falling at the end of a 5-year horizon. And we have this figure on the left here. Also, during the same 5-year period, the deficit to GDP ratio should be below 3% at the end of that 5-year period. Now we can see here that the debt to GDP ratio indicated on the left with the gray shaded area is around 100% at the end of the 5-year period. Now this is still increasing. Likewise, deficit to GDP at the end of this 5-year rolling horizon is expected to be around 4.5%. So again, also above target. Now, this should give us pause for thought about the usefulness of the current fiscal rules, given that they're not being met. Now, in practice, the functionality of these rules, they exist to provide assurance to the market, to provide confidence to international investors, and to act as a commitment device to ensure that governments maintain a sustainable fiscal spending path. However, as these are not being met in practice, some of the utility is lost here. So in the short run, these rules are essentially quite ineffective at actually boosting public investment. Now, the reason for this is that in the short run, only 5 years away, most of the payoff to public investment falls outside of this 5-year horizon. Therefore, if there's any room for maneuver, often public investment is first on the chopping block, opposed to cutting government expenditures on current day-to-day consumption. However, as we know, public investment can actually help improve the debt to GDP ratio outside of this 5-year timeframe. So as a result, this means that the government often favors reductions in public investment expenditure when fiscal headroom is tight, as it has been recently. So as a result, to revitalize the UK economy and to boost living standards, to kickstart this revitalization of economic growth in the UK, we are proposing 3 pillars of a fiscal framework reform. So given these challenges that we've previously outlined about stagnating productivity growth, low income per capita growth, and also limited fiscal headroom, we propose these 3 pillars for reform. So the first is that we discount public investment expenditures from the current deficit, which means we separate it out from current day-to-day spending. And this is simply because investment is fundamentally different from general government expenditure because it can increase the productive long-run capacity in the economy. So it should not be treated in the same manner as government purchases. Number two is that there should be a fixed schedule for fiscal events determined well in advance. Now, this is similar to how the Bank of England organizes monetary policy committee meetings. There's no reason why the Treasury should not be empowered to schedule these meetings in advance. It provides clarity and it provides a path forward for international investors and international markets regarding the timing of fiscal events. It also helps uncouple the political cycles from the economic cycles. And thirdly, we think that there should be an incorporation of public sector net worth as a target in some shape or form. Now, public sector net worth is a more holistic measure of what the government owns, its assets versus its liabilities. Now, if there is some corporate target that includes public sector net worth, this can also help incentivize and bring up public investment, which in the UK is around 3-4%, which is below the OECD average. So this would be our pillars and our framework that we'd like to put forward. So just to leave with some of the key messages before I turn to Ed. Looking ahead, we think a revised fiscal framework is going to be vital for unlocking robust and sustained economic growth. And this is going to tie in with boosting living standards and increased investment in infrastructure and healthcare and housing, which is badly needed both outside the capital and inside the capital. We hope that these ambitious reforms can improve economic outcomes in the next parliament and beyond. We're not just talking about this 5-year political cycle. We think that these are good policies for now and good policies for well into the future. So given those messages, I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Ed, who's going to talk a little bit more about taxes and public finances. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Ben. So yeah, I'm going to talk a bit more about the public finances and maybe some of the options that are available to parties coming in. So if we go to the next slide, please. So this is just, again, showing a bit of a bigger picture on the current deficit targets. And according to the OBR's kind of projections and NIESR's forecasts, the government won't meet their current spending plans on their kind of fiscal deficit target until 2031. And we suggest that if the government did want to meet these targets, they would need to raise an average of 61 billion per annum if they wanted to meet this target sooner. And again, as Ben mentioned, in terms of the debt to GDP ratio, we see this as remaining elevated over the next few years, falling again in 2030 to 31, but again, not meeting the current fiscal rules as they stand. Perhaps more interesting picture, one that kind of shows a bit more about the state of the economy, and an important consideration is interest payments as a percentage of total government expenditure. So we can see that actually these have gone from about 8% of everything the government is spending on pre-pandemic to 11% post. And this is kind of 3% extra that is spent servicing the debt and not going to infrastructure. And this is kind of largely as a result of higher debt and higher interest rates. So this provides a bit of a more nuanced picture about the state of the economy and kind of reinforces the point that the fiscal targets, they're a bit arbitrary. We need to actually drill down into what's going on and why the government may want to look at cutting expenditure or raising taxes. However, we do see 3 key risks. So we have a geopolitical risk, we have a risk around public infrastructure, and we have a risk around climate change that we believe kind of should be dealt with when thinking about fiscal targets. So in terms of geopolitical risk, the current government has already pledged to increase their defense spending to 2.5% of GDP, and this will definitely have an impact on meeting those fiscal targets that they've set up for themselves. And also, if we look further ahead, there's going to be risks of more conflict, more wars. We can see how this has had an impact on energy prices, on import prices, increasing inflation, inflationary pressures, and causing the central bank to keep their interest rates higher for longer. So this is something that government should be aware of and how they deal with these risks. Also, a key risk around maintaining public infrastructure. This will be covered more by my colleague Arnab when he talks about living standards. but we really need investment to maintain services at an adequate level. And we need targeted welfare, and we need kind of a big boost to productivity. So, of course, this is going to put pressure on public finances too. And finally, combating climate change, which is a serious long-term risk, and we kind of urgently need to decarbonize the economy. And this requires a lot of investment, particularly in the energy sectors, the building sectors, and the transport sectors. And we really need the government to push ahead and to attract private sector investment, kind of mix it together with this boost in productivity. So this will affect public finances as well. Although on the flip side, using carbon tax revenue, this will sort of mitigate some of the pressures on public finances. So when thinking about these key risks, we just need to think maybe to correct course, public finances may need to worsen before they can improve, especially in terms of fiscal targets. But let's say that we did want to meet the current fiscal targets as they now stand, and we just want to look at what is the best way of doing this. What can we advise to parties coming in? So we ran simulations on our model NIGEM. We can have a look at, should the government be cutting spending or increasing taxes to meet these targets? So in this simulation, we just said the government wants to decrease its deficit to GDP ratio by 1%. If it does this through increasing income taxes, what is the effect? If it does this through cutting spending, what is the effect? And you can see that in the short run, both have a similar impact. It's taking money out of the economy. It's weakening GDP growth. But in the long run, income taxes, they actually return to base. Whereas in the long run, if you cut expenditure, especially investment expenditure, this has a massive impact on the supply side of the economy and can lead to kind of worse long-run outcomes. So that's something that the government should be aware of. But this is very broad. This is very aggregate. We kind of maybe could drill down a bit into the different types. So if we look at what kind of types of taxes government should use, we can run a similar simulation. Say, let's say the government wanted to raise an extra 1 billion a quarter, and it can choose a different tax to do this in. Now we can see corporation tax definitely has the biggest negative impact in the long run. And then again, this is because of the supply side issues. So if governments increase corporation tax, it disincentivizes investment and leads to issues further down the line. Indirect taxes feed through directly into prices. They're quite regressive. They have quite a big impact. So again, we don't recommend VAT rises. And this has, a severe short-term effect and a kind of persistent long-term effect too. With income taxes, there's a slightly, there's not as much of a long-term, a short-term or long-term impact. It's quite close to baseline. So this kind of suggests that this would be the preferred taxation method if you did want to use taxes to plug the gap, so to speak. We can look at a similar graph, but for cutting expenditure. And again, if we say government should cut investment expenditure, massive long-term impact. So we really, really don't advise that. And we really think that incoming parties need to be aware of these issues and need to think about not cutting investment. And if they think about kind of that sweet spot of government consumption where it doesn't actually affect the supply side of the economy, that's probably where they should be targeting spending cuts. They can also cut social transfers. This has a very kind of a very small impact on the economy. However, we really advise against this as well, because this has a big impact on the real personal disposable income, especially of the lowest earners. So we think governments and parties, when they come in, just need to be careful about what they're thinking about. And kind of, I guess, our takeaway messages is that you should be raising, sorry, previous slide, that you should be raising income taxes to be the least distortionary. We also think that a land value tax should be explored. There's a lot of economic research that suggests that this is a non-distortionary tax that can actually improve welfare for everyone, which is really good. We talk about that a bit more in our election briefing, but we definitely think that's something that should be on the agenda. And our key messages in terms of expenditure: if you have to cut expenditure, really focus on that consumption expenditure, the one that has the smallest growth impact. Be careful not to cut investment. And when you're thinking of cutting investment, you've got to pay really close attention to what are the intangible assets. So the human capital, the risks in the future, things that will affect long-term supply side things. And to kind of summarize it all, I think the key question we want parties to answer is, why do you want to meet the fiscal targets? And do the costs in productivity growth outweigh the inflationary pressures and the things that will come when you don't meet the fiscal targets? That's for parties to answer. And there is a trade-off. And when they're thinking about that as well, are tax increases or spending cuts, are they in the right area? Or will you seriously negatively impact productivity and living conditions? So that's what we want parties to be aware of when they're planning their spending plans. And now I'll hand over to my colleague Arnab.
Thank you very much, Adrian, Ben, and Ed. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. So I'm now going to follow on with talking about a little bit about living standards, what we mean by living standards. Living standards is a very broad word. I'm going to come to that in a few minutes. But just to set the scene, the parliament is now dissolved, and with election battle drums sounding loud up and down the country, and with the elusive quest for the attention of the median voter proceeding in earnest, what we're going to do today is give you a sense of where we are in terms of living standards and the evolution of living standards since the last election in December 2019, and then policy recommendations to raise living standards to their pre-pandemic levels and beyond. Before I proceed any further, just a brief note on what we mean by living standards. Of course, is multidimensional. So most of what I'm going to talk about here, what we're going to mean is household disposable incomes adjusted for inflation, so rise in prices, accounting for household composition effects, and taking out housing costs. So that is our narrow definition of living standards for much of this presentation. Of course, in the briefings, you're going to find much more about different dimensions of living standards. So this is equivalized household real disposable income. So with that definition in place, living standards have fallen about 7% on average across all households over the period 2019 to 2024. Well, this broad figure hides a lot of distributional implications beneath it. So there's large distributional variation. There's 20% fall for the bottom 10th of households, and about 8% for the second to the fourth quartile. So the bottom 40% of households, almost up to the half of the population, they have had falls in living standards by this definition of at least 8%, much more at the bottom end. So this bottom 40%, they will not return to pre-pandemic benchmarks by 2028, particularly given the fact that we also see the economic growth rate as being anemic into the foreseeable future, or 3, 4, 5 years. So overall, what we suggest is targeted welfare in the short run to mitigate part of the effect of this fall in living standards, and particularly the distributional implications of that. So targeted upon the poor, but also together with growth and productivity boosting policy for the long run, which Ed has also talked about. Right. So how did we come where we are at the moment? So the biggest thing here is the fall in household real disposable income equivalent adjusted for household size. Over the term of this parliament, over the 5 years, at the bottom end, there's a fall about 20%. Above the horizontal line, what you can see is the effect of changes in taxes and national insurance rates, and the fact that the thresholds have not changed relative to 2019-20. All right. So the immediate observation is that the effect of taxes and rates have been relatively small, very, very small compared to the overall fall in living standards. And that goes all the way through the distribution, but particularly incident upon the bottom half of the distribution. So particularly the poorest tenth and the next 3 deciles. So if we now look at what happens after disposable income, so that is on the income side of the household balance sheet, if you may. On the expenditure side, on these lower household disposable incomes, there is a large hit. There is a large hit from both the cost of living crisis, so inflation, but also in controlling inflation, the Bank of England has raised interest rates, so that has exacerbated borrowing costs particularly for lower income households. And below the horizontal line here, you can see the split between these two across the distribution of households, starting from the bottom decile or the bottom tenth of the population on the left, slowly rightwards to more affluent segments of the population. And by and large, both of these are coincident upon households. Of course, as a proportion of their overall household income, we can see in the the hard line, the hard black line, that impact relative to household incomes is lesser at the top end, about 3% or so, and much more at the bottom end, about 9-10%, right? And also in the middle, the squeezed middle, that has returned. So there is a higher impact upon them. Relative to these impacts of the cost of living crisis and interest rate rises as a result of that, state support on the top of the horizontal line is relatively small. But not only is it relatively small, it is also largely on aggregate regressive. If you go to the next slide, we can see how this pans out. So at the bottom end, of course, there are the cost of living payments and the, in 22, 23, and 23, 24, which dominate. But at the top end, the reason this is largely regressive is because the energy price guarantee and the energy bill support payments, they benefit more affluent households who consume more energy. So by not targeting this, we have done 2 things. One is that state support, central state support, has been made more regressive, but also maybe we lost a low-hanging fruit of trying to combat climate change as well by incentivizing lower energy consumption for more affluent households. Overall, total effect is about of state support, or the magnitude of state support is about £2,000 for the poorest households, poorest tenth of the households, but much more than that, certainly above 3,000, 3,500 pounds for the richest households. So that is very regressive. And once again, there's the tapering in the middle, which brings out the fact of the squeezed middle. Where does this leave us? So another important policy change which has happened recently is the rise in minimum wages. And of course, minimum wages only benefit poor households, poor working individuals in these poor households. And there are income and consumption effects, of course. But the more important thing is the income versus substitution effects have worked in favor of towards a better economy in the short run, particularly as both inactivity rates have fallen and unemployment rates have also fallen for these, particularly in the second decile of the income distribution. So, there are some low-hanging fruits there as well, which the government can think about as they move towards, trying to improve living standards in the context of the next parliament or the term of the next parliament. Taking this together, our overall key policy recommendations are, as Ben and Ed have emphasized, really we cannot overemphasize the need for a new fiscal framework which is fit for purpose. In terms of policy, we suggest targeted welfare in the short to medium run, but this is really short to medium run. What kind of targeted welfare? Well, universal credit uplift, cost of living payments, childcare support, things like that, which benefit poorer households more. Taxes and minimum wages, they are again progressive and benefit lower income households more if they are designed appropriately, particularly with respect to taxes. It is not only about the tax rate, but the decisions that the next government makes about the thresholds. So if the thresholds are allowed to move, that would make the impacts progressive, so short to medium run. And most importantly, this is though not going to take us out of the growth and productivity doldrums that the economy faces and that we are in at the moment. So we need boosting that. So in the medium to long run, public investments, not only public investments, but the kinds of public investments that are going to crowd in private investments in line with increasing productivity, particularly in the area of infrastructure, apprenticeships and skills, housing, R&D, and most importantly, also sustainable local authority finances. So the local authority finances are in very poor shape and they need to be supported. So there's institutional capital as well, which is required in addition to fixed capital. Thank you. I'll leave it there and over to you, Adrian.
Well, Ben, Ed, and Arnab, thank you very, very much indeed for the presentations. We now have just under an hour for questions. I'm going to ask those who've already put questions in the chat to ask those questions. So we're going to give you the floor. And of course, we very warmly encourage everyone in this webinar to come in and ask questions and make comments. Just to say, as you think about questions, we will be publishing the full briefings on our dedicated general election webpage today. There will also be a recording of this event. And we've got, besides the 3 briefings today, 2 more to come, one on productivity and one on climate and macro economics as well. So there is more material to come, and indeed there will be a further briefing on leveling up as well. So lots more to engage with, but for now, let me open this up for questions. I'd like to invite 3 participants who've already put questions in the chat to ask their question. The first one is Rena, and then we also have Air and Tom. So in that order, if we can. So could we give the floor, please, to Rena Farah, who has a question about tax? Okay, so if it's easier for me to read out the question, then that's what I'll do for now, as we explore whether it's possible for people to come in. So Rena Fair is asking the following question. Most parties are promising no tax increases, but is that realistic? What is NIESR's view on this matter? And let me then also share with you the questions from Tom Rees and also from So Tom is asking, how likely is it that Labour or the Conservatives can keep their promise not to increase taxes? if you don't raise the big three taxes, national insurance, income tax, and VAT, where should they raise the money from? And Air's asking, does NIESR think it's inevitable that Labour will need to raise taxes if it wins the election? And if so, do we have any thoughts on which taxes it would likely target, given that Labour have ruled out NI and income tax headline rates? And what's our recommendation for tax going forward? So I'm going to turn to Ed for some initial thoughts, and then also bring in Ben and Arnab if they wish to comment as well. So Ben, Ed, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Adrian, and thanks for the questions. I saw the news coming in this morning and I thought, oh no, this is not going to go well. I'm going to get all these questions. I think, long story short, if parties want to meet current targets, inevitably they will need to raise taxes or cut spending. We recommend income taxes if really needs be, but I think the crucial point is that this is to meet the current fiscal targets. If we have different rules, then there is more scope, there is less pressure to do this. I think we've outlined that we don't think the current rules are optimal, and they can be improved. And if we have something that encourages investment, or boost growth, boost tax revenue, and kind of reduce the need for tax increases as well. So yeah, there's two sides of the answer. If they're intent on meeting the rules, we recommend income taxes. But if they kind of think more broadly, more holistically, and are less absolutist about it, then there is less need for that.
Great, thank you, Ed. Ben and Arnab, would you like to come in on this question of tax rises as well?
Can I jump in, perhaps? A fantastic question, and of course, something that we anticipate given an election campaign which is being dominated by tax promises on no tax change, tax rate change promises. I think one of the things that we have explored and we tried to convince all of you about is that insofar as living standards are concerned, changes in taxes and thresholds make little change given the magnitude of the fall in equalized household real disposable incomes over the past 5 years. So it's really a small part of the overall question. Yes, it is an important part. And if the government now would like to go in earnest towards productivity and growth enhancing investments, of course, that money needs to come from somewhere. And the taxes are come back into the question. But insofar as the past 5 years go, the taxes have been a small part of the story. Welfare support has been a slightly more important part. But again, we think that that money could have been spent better by targeting it well. So it is not only about aggregate taxes and tax rates, and it is true that larger action has been on on fixing the thresholds rather than the tax rates as such. There are various ways of playing this, which is at the disposal or at the gift of the incoming chancellor, whosoever they may be. So taxes are important, particularly if we want to move towards long-term prosperity in the country. But taxes are only important insofar as that money can be spent appropriately in trying to boost our growth and productivity prospects. Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you for that, Arnab. I would just like to echo what Ed and Arnab have said on this question. And I'd also like to add that I think the ball is very much in both parties' courts to provide the workings which justify this policy, which is basically saying we're not going to raise taxes because according to our outlooks and according to our forecasts, there is essentially no fiscal headroom. And to just maintain the existing provision of government services would require some tax increases, some increase in the tax base, given that we've had 2 national insurance cuts over the last year. And I think that really it's incumbent upon the people who are making the manifesto to show their costings. And, you know, if this is genuinely a realistic policy, then show your workings, and we're happy to be persuaded otherwise. But given where we stand, given the data that we have, we think that this isn't a credible fiscal path forward.
Thank you, Ed, Arnab, and Ben. I think it's really, really important to reiterate this point that we've been making our quarterly economic outlook for the UK, that the current fiscal plans, are essentially implying some very, very drastic cuts post-election. Right? If everything remains the same, tax and the current plans as they stand, we're looking at something like 14% of cuts across the board, except for ring-fenced departments. Now, that is simply politically and economically and socially unrealistic. So it is indeed, as everyone has said, incumbent on the parties to show how these sums add up. And that is to assume the current state. If we're thinking that public services need to be repaired, that we need more investment, for higher growth and higher productivity, then indeed, more spending will need to happen. And as we've been saying, investment is the key thing, not so much consumption spending, but investment. And that would, we think, be best done by looking at this fiscal framework and rethinking the rules and really putting the emphasis on the objectives. What are we trying to achieve? And then work backwards from the objectives that we're trying to achieve to the best instruments that can enable us to get there. Great. Well, thank you so much for that first round of questions. We now got some more questions, and I'm very keen to bring in people so that they can ask the question directly. So we have a question on the labour market, and I would like us to give the floor to Dimi, who has a question on the labour market, gaps in the labour market, and increasing economic inactivity, how that might be affecting the economy. So Dimi, can we give you the floor, and you can put that question to Ben, Ed, and Arnab.
Good morning. It's just the question that you read, how the labor market, the cracked labor market, and the economic inactivity, the increasing economic inactivity may affect the economy for the next few years, and how the elections and the new party may tackle this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to turn to Ben for that. Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Dimi. So at the moment, over the last few years since the pandemic, we've had a rise in inactivity, and we've had about 750,000 people actually leave the labour market due to long-term sickness. So this is a quite considerable reduction in the labour supply for the UK labour market. And naturally, this is quite problematic, because we've got a large section of people that were previously working that are no longer working. Now, if they're genuinely long-term sick, obviously you have to provide for that, and those provisions must be made. However, on the other hand, we can't ignore the fact that there's been this huge negative labour supply shock, and this clearly has implications for labour market tightness, which we saw spike quite recently over the last couple of years. It's coming back down now, and also it has implications for wage inflation as well. So both of these taken together, it's a serious consideration. So the productive long-run potential is governed by our productivity growth, our capital stock, but also our labour supply. So boosting labour supply and getting people back into work, if they're able to, is something that definitely should be considered. We should provide for people who are long-term sick. And one of the issues is also that we have had an increase in waiting times. There has been inability to get people the proper treatment that they need. So part of this rise could be the fact that we haven't invested heavily enough in our healthcare service as well. But we need to address both of these as an investment issue as well. So investing in healthcare is also protecting the human capital and protecting the labour supply of the UK economy. If you don't have healthy workers, you won't have a labour supply at all. So really, we should reframe these as rather just expenditures, but they're investments in human capital and investments in the workforce. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Ben. We're going to move on to a question by Anna Frankel on taxing the value of assets. So Anna, could we bring you in, please?
Morning. I'm interested in your views on taxation, but so far you haven't addressed the question of the increase in value in assets, both at household and also at business level. Is there any scope for raising tax from those aspects of the economy?
Thank you very much, Anna. Ed, may I turn to you for that question?
You can indeed. So I think with this question, we need to think very carefully about what is the value of asset and what does that mean. So in our briefing, we talk a lot about land value tax, and the value of the asset there is the land, the underlying thing. And because of that, when the taxation is made, it's non-distortionary. So that would be one where we said, yes, in this instance, we should increase kind of the value. We should kind of be taxing in that way when we're thinking about assets. But if it's an other asset, and I'm afraid I don't have the research to kind of answer this question fully here, but we need to be thinking about how distortionary is that going to be, and what will be the effect on kind of investment, supply, and demand.
Great. Thank you very much indeed for that question, Anna, and thanks, Ed. We're going to move on now to a question from Mark Williams. Can we bring in Mark? And then it's back to Tom Rees. So Mark Williams first.
Thanks, everyone. We've already touched on this a bit, but it'd be interesting to hear in a little bit more detail. There was a suggestion on one of the charts there that one of the better ways to reduce spending would be by cutting current government consumption. I wanted to hear the panel's thoughts on how realistic that is as a prospect, given the current state of public services, and whether they can actually bear any more cuts. Is it even worth considering as an option?
Let me bring in Ben on that question, if I may, and then I'll have some thoughts as well. Ben, would you like to?
Yeah, thank you for your question, Mark. So I'm trying to understand and make sure I got your question correctly. So I'm not sure we characterized it as necessarily cutting government purchases or government consumption. It was more that the current rules tend to have a bias towards reductions in public investment when there is a contraction in output, because the demand from the fiscal mandate is that there needs to be a falling debt to GDP ratio within a relatively short time frame, which is 5 years. Now, most of the payoff for public investment, i.e. the increase in output, which you receive, often falls outside of that 5-year window. So there's a natural bias towards cutting that public investment expenditure because you don't see any of the benefits right away. They fall outside of that horizon, so they're essentially discounted. So this is why we think there is a sort of inconsistency within this framework, and it is not optimal. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we advocate cutting government consumption per se. It's just about having the correct treatment of government consumption versus government investment. And the difference is that government investment has the ability to raise output in the long run. Now, transfers are important because in a system of fiscal transfers, we obviously want to ensure that people have sufficient means for living and that their living standards are good. So we do have transfers. But we're not necessarily advocating for a reduction in government expenditure in the short run. But I'm just trying to sort of make sure that I understood your question correctly as well. But Adrian, you may have some points that you want to pick up on this one as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for the question, Mark, and thanks, Ben. So I suppose, besides what Ben has said, which is really the key point on, that balance between consumption spending and investment spending, the other thing that's worth thinking about is not just the size of the state, but also its effectiveness. So there's been a lot of comments, in the last few years since COVID, and then the spike in inflation about how the size of the state has grown so much, and taxes have gone up, and spending has gone up, and where that leaves the British economy. And I suppose one of the things we've always focused on is just how effective is government spending. It's not so much the size of the state that is the key thing, but actually whether it delivers. So the state of the public services, as you said, the state of infrastructure. And here I think there is a question of the balance between how much money is going to the front line, right, to doctors and nurses and to teachers and to everyone who's actually delivering public services, including the key workers during the pandemic who kept the country and the economy going, versus how much is going into areas that could be considered to be less productive. There's a lot of auditing, a lot of accountancy, a lot of managerial processes that are perhaps not the most productive parts of the public sector. And I do think we need to ask that question. So, what we're saying is that what we absolutely don't want to see is any cuts to frontline services because they're already not in a good shape, and it would hit the poorest hardest if we made further cuts to the frontline. Whether there is some slack elsewhere in how the state works at all levels, central government, city regions, and local authorities, I think that is a question worth asking. Now, political parties tend to approach this in terms of value for money. Whether that's helpful or not, I'm not sure. But the key thing is really the productivity within the public sector and how we can reinforce that. What investments are required to drive our productivity so we can actually deliver public services that are commensurate with the needs of the country and the people. So we are very interested in those questions, and we do think there's much more work to be done to get productivity up in the private sector, but also in the public sector. Let's move on to the next question, and it's back to Tom Rees. So Tom, welcome and thanks for coming in.
Yeah, I just have a question on the 7% fall in living standards. I just wonder if you have any size and scope on that, and is this the biggest fall over a parliamentary term that we've seen? Yeah, that's it basically.
Right, thank you, Tom. Let me turn to Arnab for that, and then we'll see whether Ben and Ed want to come in as well.
Thank you, Tom. It's a great question. So we have seen some comparisons done by researchers in this area with respect to comparing across different terms of parliament. And by and large, I think the way that our own work goes, I think it is, it looks quite likely. We have not looked at the exact numbers going all the way back, like some other researchers have done. Having said that, I think this is a fair way to think about things. But also the additional bit that we want to highlight is it is not only about this 7% in aggregate that is important. Of course, that is important. That sets the benchmark. But it is the distributional consequences of that. So 7% in aggregate in this particular term of parliamentary term meant 20% fall for the lowest tenth of the households, which is really devastating, and that is something that we want to highlight quite a bit, and also that it is not only the lowest tenth or the poorest tenth, all the way up to the fourth decile, 40th percentile. People have struggled as a combination of falling household incomes in the way that we have calculated, and that is along the lines of the household below average income statistics of the ONS and the DWP. So there's a distributional story here as well, but by and large, it seems that this is very large. Whether it is the largest or not is an important question, but the distributional consequences are also an important question. Thank you.
Yeah, and just a footnote to say, it's really the case that while real wage growth has picked up and picked up quite a bit since the second half of 2022, it's also the case that housing costs have gone up by so much that they've wiped out the benefits of real wage growth. And that's really the story here, which of course then puts the spotlight squarely on housing, on the stock, on affordable housing, on where houses are being built, where they're not being built, and so on. So housing is a very, very significant part of this living standard story, and we really must be connecting all those dots. So thank you, Tom, and thanks to Arnab. Now we have a question next from Noah Rotterville. And in fact, Noah's got two questions. So Noah, thank you so much for joining us, and please go ahead with your questions.
Yeah, hi, thank you. So I have two questions on two different topics. So firstly, I was interested in the discussion of Brexit, because in the political debate and now with you guys economically, that's not really been discussed anymore. And I was thinking, to what extent can trade relations be improved in terms of like a fiscally costless way of improving growth rates? Should I also ask my second question, or?
Yeah, please do ask the second one as well, Noah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. My second question is, you talked a lot about investment and how that's very important for the British economy. How would you recommend investment be targeted? Like, what should the government be spending money on? And geographically, where should they be focusing on? Because I think there's a lot of debate about, do we need more spending on London, or should we, diversify and spend more in the Midlands or in the North?
Great, thank you so much, Noah. I'm going to ask all three panelists to come in and to tackle either of the two questions. So let me start with Ben.
Thanks for your questions, Noah. So on investment, business investment in the UK is around 9% of GDP on average. So that's well below the OECD average. It sits us in the bottom 2/3, essentially. So for comparable economies, our business investment is relatively low. And obviously, we need investment in capital stock so that we actually have the means of production to be able to increase output and have robust economic growth. So with regards to that, I think definitely there has been some movement in the right direction. There's been the full expensing accounting, which has been to essentially discount some of the investment expenditures from taxation. So this has obviously provided a bit of boost. On the other hand, this was being offset by a rise in corporation tax. Of course, we want to have a complementarity between public investment and private investment as well. So we think that also that if the government actually manages to sort of kickstart public investment and raise it in a sustained manner, that this will also engender an environment of sort of more optimism from the private sector. And this can also sort of increase business investment. If people see that, okay, well, the government's investing in infrastructure, it's taking things seriously, it's trying to improve transport, then the private sector also may say, well, okay, I can see that there is actually investment going on here. It's worthwhile for me to invest as well. So they think, well, if the government leads the way on this, they also may move. So I think that's something worth considering. With regards to the regions and the locality of this investment, I would definitely hand that over to Adrian and Arnab, who know a lot more than I do on the regions.
Well, thank you so much, Ben. Ed, would you like to come in on either the two questions, the Brexit trade question and the investment one, and then we'll definitely bring an Arnab about, on the regions.
Yeah, so for the investment one, I think what we need to be focusing our investment on would be related to kind of green objectives, reaching net zero. And so for these reasons, the three sectors we need to be looking at are the energy sectors, the building sector, and the transport sector. And especially now, we've kind of made a lot of progress in terms of the green transition. But a lot of what we've done have been the quick wins. And now we're really getting to the point where it's a lot more effort to go that bit extra in terms of decarbonizing the economy. And these three sectors are the ones that kind of still need that extra push. I'd also like to bring in sort of an answer to a question that I think Dayu asks later on about, is government spending on education considered government consumption, and should that be considered investment? Kind of bringing this in, the government needs to think holistically about what is investment. It's not just kind of machinery and factories. We need to be thinking about kind of educating workforces. And in some ways, you can consider wages to be an investment in the economy, because with higher wages, you have more motivated staff, more productivity. They're going to work better. They're going to lead to less kind of risks because they're there maintaining the capital and the equipment. So there's going to be less impairment costs later on. So I guess, yeah, to summarize, three sectors: energy, building, and transport, but thinking very holistically about what investment is and what it means for the economy.
Great, thanks, Ed. Arnab, on investment in the regions.
Thank you very much. Very thought-provoking question. So I am going to sort of take both the questions together in a little bit, but somewhat complementing what Ben and Ed have already said. And I'm going to say sort of four things. One is that, of course, living standards we have seen have fallen over the past, term of the past parliament now, right? Okay, but that one of the major reasons that happened was a combination of three major shocks, and Brexit is one of those three major shocks. There was the pandemic shock, there was Brexit, and there was the cost of living, shock as well, right? So so the Brexit is also important in understanding the process of Brexit in terms of what it has done to living standards and living conditions of households. So that's one point. The second one about what investments and what areas, and particularly given the fact that London and the Southeast, are the most productive regions of the country. So should investments really continue to fall upon those areas? They have been, largely infrastructure investments have fallen on those areas disproportionately, whether that is fair and that is appropriate for the future. The big challenge in terms of leveling up, despite the nice work that the government so one needs to admit the leveling up white paper was a fantastic step in the right direction, and they're thinking about this, is that amongst advanced economies, Britain has probably the largest gap between the best performing regions, i.e. London and the Southeast, the metropolitan areas of the Southeast, and the second tier cities, the Manchesters, the Birminghams, the Glasgows, and so on and so forth. So this gap is huge. And if this gap can somehow be bridged a little bit, reduced a little bit through investments, strategically chosen investments, then what it would do is potentially also increase the productivity in London and the Southeast. So there's a, in some ways there is a a win-win situation for all here, which really needs to be exploited, and that is where I think one of the things that the incoming government, whosoever they may be, should think about. The third point, which is also related to this, is the question of complementarity. Means public investments would not, in and of themselves, raise productivity and growth. They can, provided they're chosen in a way that crowds in private investments, and the two together can try and build this gap. With that in mind, and thinking through what kind of investments there may be and where they may be most valuable, we have thought about infrastructure investments, of course, road infrastructure, train infrastructure, railway, and broadband connectivity, where there has been substantial progress. Investments in skills and apprenticeships, higher and further education colleges. Housing is a very important concern, particularly in Britain, and not least, also investments in institutional capital. So the local authority finances are in terrible state across the country, and that also brings us to the question of what are investments, which Ed rightly pointed out, and whether investments should really be part of this, rather arbitrary fiscal rules that the government sets up. So whether that is about, things which are more of a, government consumption, kind of, setting, or what are investments and how one needs to think about this. And we would argue that actually enhancements to institutional, capital should be sort of thought of as, enriching investments for the future of the country. So I think that is where I would put it. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed for the questions, and thanks to the panel. Next question is by Paul Hannon. Can we give Paul the floor? And yes, great. Paul, welcome.
Hi, good morning, and thanks for the presentation. Can you hear me?
Yes, very, very well.
Great, wonderful. Okay, I'm just wondering about what function the fiscal targets perform. So, I mean, they're there presumably to sort of reassure gilt buyers that things aren't going to get out of hand. So there is a benefit in the sense that, you know, borrowing costs are presumably being kept lower than they might otherwise have been. So is it a case that if you sort of didn't have a fiscal target, borrowing costs would rise? Or do you think we've gotten to the point where, which I feel we have, judging by conversations I've had with investors, where people realize that these are actually very problematic and that they're long-term reducing the capacity of the British economy to, you know, honor government debt? So where are we now? And just one final question. The other thing that occurs to me is that, you know, the Conservative Party sort of favorite voter demographic is in a way a creditor as well, right? I mean, they're going to rely on this income stream for their income stream pensions. So are they kind of keen on seeing the government explicitly promise not to go crazy on the borrowing front and therefore risk default on their pensions? Is that a possible way of understanding why this has been sort of adhered to for so long, when it's been kind of clear that it's not been great in a broad economic policy sense?
Great, two really fascinating questions. Let me turn to Ed first and then Ben, but no doubt Arnab has some thoughts as well. So Ed, may I ask you to come in?
Yeah, of course. So I'll take the first question, which I think is about the impact on bond investors and gilts. And I think it's really hitting the nail on the head here, which is that if you have a government promising to meet these fiscal targets, whatever the cost, that can lead to a lot of uncertainty. So, for example, going through COVID, it made absolute sense for the government to step in and kind of keep the economy afloat. And that's the sort of confidence that investors need. They don't need a government saying, I'm not going to invest in the economy because that will affect my fiscal targets. So I really do believe that by kind of changing how we think about the fiscal targets, that will be better for kind of gilt yields and bond investors in terms of just providing that confidence and that credibility that maybe the government isn't going to hit the kind of 5-year target, but they do have a strategic linked up plan for growth in the economy that will provide a lot of kind of certainty and benefit to the economy.
Great, thank you, Ed. Ben.
Yeah, thanks for your questions, Paul. Really very interesting questions. So on the first point on the gilt market, I think the question is the fiscal rules are there because they want to communicate sustainability of the public debt, and they want to communicate as a commitment device that the government is serious and responsible when it comes to fiscal matters. Now, the current rules, they communicate that in a certain way, but that's not the only way to communicate that. And fundamentally, when it comes to the sustainability of public debt, it depends crucially not on what happens with any given 5-year rolling target, but it crucially depends on what is the future path of government tax revenues, what is the future path of government spending. So as long as those future paths are sustainable and they can be shown to be sound, then I don't think there should be too much concern from the gilt market. For example, we're talking about net zero. There is a legal mandate for net zero by 2050. Now, there does need to be some investment in green infrastructure to ensure that that legal mandate is met. To ensure that happens, the government is going to have to probably borrow to invest. As long as that can be communicated to international markets in a way that this is a credible policy, this needs to happen, we're going to pay X, you're going to get Y. As long as that's communicated in a clear way, I don't think that some arbitrary value of 3% or whatever it may be for deficit and some other value for debt to GDP ratio, I don't think those in themselves, a singular focus on those numbers, on those targets, can always be the most effective way to communicate stability when it comes to fiscal policy. With regards to the second point about pensions, I think this is a really valid consideration. And I think it's something worth exploring a bit more. Clearly, there is obviously quite a lot of stake for people who have their pensions, which obviously contain a component of these gilts as part of their portfolio. And of course, any increase in that would make them cautious because you want to be quite risk averse at the end of your life when it comes to pensions. So you're not going to be a big risk taker, and government bonds are a very safe bet. However, as I said, it really comes to the communication. As long as you can convince and assuage, international investors, international markets that these are sound policies, I don't think that's necessarily an issue. And the question comes is when you sort of circumvent the OBR or you take things on a different path where you don't communicate things clearly and you don't communicate them in a credible way, and the authority of sort of sound, independent economic institutions are not respected, that's when you get into a little bit of a sticky situation.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ben. Arnaud.
Yeah, let me come in just very briefly on the question of, on both the questions. And both the questions relate to one single thing, which is about the sustainability of the repayment commitments of the government over a long run. It is not a short-run issue that is at question here. It is a long-run issue. And what is it that is going to convince investors in the best possible way that there is that the state, the British government will fulfill its commitments, debt repayment commitments over the long run. And because it is a long-run question, so what is very important also is the trajectory of the economy over the long run, A, and B also, in some ways about providing for people in a long-run sense or a lifetime sense, if so. I think both of those things are important. The state that we are in, we think that without substantial investments, public investments, together with private investments that can crowd in private investments, we are potentially not getting towards a growth and productivity boosting situation in the medium to long run, and that is a threat. With respect to pensions, we are going to do quite a bit of work in this area. So please watch this space. So we have already started doing that. One important point which comes to us, so through our work, recent work on pension wealth and, the pension vehicles, etc., more will be coming, is that if there is one of the areas where there has been some progress in the medium run past in Britain is in slightly greater sustainability of people's lives in retirement, right? And that is something which needs to be recognized. So the focus currently in some ways in terms of concerns is more about child poverty than on old age poverty, but the situation was not like this 20 years back. So I think that is an important question. So that having said, so therefore this sustainability of the pension pots and what it can deliver in the medium to long run is of paramount concern. But once again, the important questions are about the growth path of the economy in the medium to long run, not necessarily the short term, even a parliamentary term, even if we understand that the rules, fiscal rules and so on and so forth somehow need to be somewhat short term in nature, or have been somewhat short term in nature. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much to Paul for the two questions, and thank you to the panel. Next, we have some questions from Anne also. So can we bring in Anne, please? And if you'd like to ask the question also about taxation, then please do so. So all three, if you like.
Sure, I had two questions, I think. So it's just, you mentioned the 7% hit to living standards since the last election. So I was just wondering if you have any projections for when living standards might surpass 2019 levels again. And then separately, just on long-term sickness, I was just wondering if the panel thinks either political party has a credible plan for dealing with the rise in long-term sickness. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. On living standards, reverting to December 2019 levels, I'm going to turn to Arnab.
Thank you. Fantastic questions here. Yeah, well, we have some projections, and they are not looking very pretty at the moment. So in terms of reaching living standards commensurate with the pre-pandemic world that we were in, of course, we are sort of in a new normal now. So even reaching that level, we are seeing 2028, 29 as the kind of period that when we would reach those levels again. Yeah.
So again, this is always, pretty much bearing in mind that housing is this big, factor that has affected living standards so massively. On inactivity, I'm going to ask Ben to say a few words. Have we seen credible plans to bring down long-term sickness and deal with this inactivity problem?
So yeah, as I sort of reiterate from earlier, long-term sickness, economic inactivity is around 750,000 higher than it was before the pandemic, which is really substantial. That's a considerable fraction of the workforce that have just left due to long-term sickness. And you see this in the hours work data, and you see this also in the average hourly work data. So according to the ONS experimental estimates, actual hours worked, total hours worked, is pretty much about where it was at the end of 2019 before the pandemic. However, the population has increased. So the average hours worked are actually lower than they were. So at the intensive margin, people are working fewer hours. And that's obviously not a good thing for economic output and productivity. In terms of actually addressing this, well, there's sort of two fronts. One is that there was a health shock during COVID, and that some people are obviously genuinely long-term sick and they cannot return to the labor market. The question is, are there some people who are in long-term sickness and they just haven't been able to get the treatment that they need to re-enter the labor market? And that's a serious question, and we're doing some work on this at the moment. And so again, watch this space, and that's hopefully something that we're going to explore going forward. But it's very much early days at the moment. But this is a serious question, and we very much want to look at, if the increase in these waiting times and the inability to access NHS services has contributed to this. So yeah, very much work in progress. So thank you for that question.
Can I come in very briefly, just to highlight also, this long-term sickness and rising inactivity, that has not only implications for the output that is generated by the economy and the productivity associated with that, but it also has implications for the expenditure side of the government balance sheet. And Ben has pointed out, the NHS costs and so on and so forth. That is one side of it. The other side are benefit costs as well. So there are large costs here of not having a large enough working population willing to work and participating in the labor market. I think that is something which we recognize and try to put forward. Thank you.
Yeah, and as with so many economic and social questions, it's very complex in terms of skills, right? And skills gaps we're seeing in the labor market as well. We don't have some of the STEM graduates that we need. We don't have some of the technical vocational skills that we need. And also, really important to realize that, until real wage growth picked up, there was also the fact that low wages weren't helping, right? And that people dropped out of the labor market because they simply couldn't find employment that was working for them. So thank you for all those questions. We've got one more from a participant who doesn't have a microphone. So I'll read out the question now, and then we'll bring in another participant as well. So the question is as follows. If the UK wants to stimulate growth, should it not seek to rejoin the European single market? has NIESR done any modeling of what might the impact be of doing so? I'm going to ask Ed to say something about that. So over to you, Ed.
So yeah, we have done some modeling on this. If you look, we published a paper in November last year, which was revisiting the issue of Brexit and kind of estimating the impact that had. And we did estimate it to be quite negative. So as a result of this, we do think that kind of if you were to look at improving trade relations and trade ties, especially with the euro area, that would have a positive impact on growth.
Yeah, and I think we can also see the effects of the current arrangements on certain parts of the country. I mean, we touched on regions a little earlier in this conversation. And what our regional work has shown, and Arnab can say a little more, is, where there are export businesses that have been hit by new trade restrictions, we've really seen an adverse impact. So one example in the country is the Midlands, where you've got various businesses that have been hit by these new trade restrictions, road haulage businesses and others, facing a lot more paperwork and really taking quite a significant hit from the way that the trade and cooperation agreement has been designed and delivered. And so there is certainly going to be a case for looking at some of this when the trade and cooperation agreement is up for renew, which will be in 2026. And of course, a lot of preparation will no doubt happen already on that later this year and next. So this is certainly an area where things have not gone well for certain businesses, and it's having a lasting impact. I don't know whether, Arnab, you want to say a couple of words on it.
Yes, sure. So we have done a bit of work on this, and manufacturing suffered hugely, both as a result of the COVID crisis and the crash in manufacturing as such, and the supply chain disruptions that started during that period and continued through Brexit onto the cost of living precious period as well. And trading, as Adrian rightly pointed out, again, both manufacturing and trading impacted the Midlands quite a lot. Also, parts of the Southeast. So what is important in terms of understanding the geographical landscape of the country is not only differences across, but also within regions. And there are areas which have suffered. Have there been places which have been gainers in the short run? Yes, potentially yes. And we have pointed out in our previous outlooks that the certain areas in Northern Ireland, so certain activities in Northern Ireland which have benefited from part of the time being within two different trading zones in a way, so because of the way that the Brexit process continued. But we have always said that if those gains, short-term gains, are not put in the bag to try and get towards situations of long-term productivity and growth, these gains will be largely short-term, and they turn out to be the case as well. So yes, there are gainers and losers in various places, various sectors, and various parts of the country. Thank you.
Great. We have time for one more question, and that is by Dao Chen. So can we bring in Dao, please? And that will be the final question for today.
Hi, my question's already been answered by Ed. I was basically alluding to the fact, so by the way, fantastic presentation. I will be reading your publications. My question's been answered by Ed. Basically it was about government spending and whether the correct classification has been done or not. So I'm not going to say anymore. It's already been answered. Thanks.
So this is about the balance between consumption and investment, right, when it comes to education?
I could add a bit more into that if you'd like, which is that I think when we're thinking about investment, it's all to do with the capital stock of the nation and what the impact is on that. So of course, direct investment in machinery, you're just purely adding the capital stock there. I talk about when you think about education and kind of the NHS, healthcare, they all have an indirect effect on the capital stock in terms of kind of efficiency, productivity, maintaining it as well, making sure it maybe depreciates at a slower rate, making sure that it doesn't kind of fall apart because no one's there to look at it or no one knows how to repair it properly. So that's just the kind of why I was trying to allude to, that we need to be focused on the capital stock, and from that we need to think about what will impact that capital stock and how we can make sure that it is maintained and grows.
Yeah, I'd also like to come in on this one. So it's a good question about how we categorize what investment is. So as of now, the government does not include education expenditure as an investment. That's just a flow of services. So they employ teachers, they pay people to run schools. So that's a flow of services. But obviously the end product is that you have a stock of knowledge. You've got an educated workforce. So it does contribute to a stock in that sense, but it's very difficult to measure the stock of human capital, even though it's clearly an asset, right? If you're educated, there's a flow of output that comes from that. There's a stream of income that comes from being educated. It's very difficult to gauge it. So typically when it comes to investment, we are talking about factories, plants, machinery, infrastructure, the physical capital. And that's what the government actually lists as their investments. But I think it is useful to think about, for example, you also have like a stock of health, right? So if the workforce is healthy, then they can obviously perform their tasks well. And if you don't have an educated and healthy workforce, that's going to have implications. And I think the difference is just between stocks and flows basically here. And at the moment, there are some things which are technically not considered to be investments, but it may be useful to think about them slightly more through the lens of being an investment, because it does pay dividends in the long run, even though it's not an investment in capital and machines and things itself. So that's all I would say on that point.
Thanks, Ben.
I would also like to come in briefly on that, because the dial has sort of changed, or is changing a little bit in this direction. And please watch what we're doing in this direction, in the future. So the leveling up white paper clearly set the stage with respect to thinking about the 6 pillars of capital. And that is not only fixed capital, right? So there's human capital, of course, and we have been talking about human capital here, right? There's institutional capital, there's cultural capital, even, dare I say, maybe natural capital. So trying to think about capital stocks in a more general sense is something that we are moving towards, and we are applying our minds to it, as are other people. So the dial is sort of changing, maybe a bit slowly, but we are getting there. So but we are starting to think along those lines. Thank you.
Well, it is now 12:30, and I cannot thank our audience enough, who've really been fantastic, joining us in the hundreds this morning, and having some fantastic questions and comments, which have provided a very, very vibrant and lively discussion. So we're very, very grateful to all of you for joining us. We're very grateful to the Nuffield Foundation for supporting this work. Please do look at our dedicated general election webpage on the NIESR website. The briefings, are there, and we stand ready to answer, any further questions. If you happen to be in Westminster, then do come and see us in that building right behind us. We're currently standing outside, not in the rain, luckily. Do please drop by, and we'd be delighted to have a chat with you, and in particular to our colleagues in the media. If you have any further questions on any of the briefings or any work we're doing, we're always ready to comment, and we'd be delighted to engage with your questions further. So to everyone, a huge thanks, and of course to the 3 panelists, Ben, Ed, and Arnab as well. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a wonderful afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.